Welcome to Chapter 1 of The Case of the Clock Tower Key, a 12-part Sherlock Holmes mystery. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the story unfold. For 2 days, a profound and unsettling silence had gripped our quarter of London. It was a quiet so complete that it felt like a presence in itself. A heavy, suffocating blanket where the familiar, reassuring chimes of the St. Giles clock tower ought to have been. The great clock, which had marked the passage of our lives with steadfast regularity, had fallen mute. The city, deprived of its heartbeat, seemed to hold its breath, and an unspoken anxiety crept through the streets like the ever-present fog. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was an active force that altered the very character of the city. The usual cacophony of hooves and wheels on cobblestone seemed jarring and intrusive, without the clock's steady rhythm to anchor it. Street vendors, normally boisterous and cheerful, called out their wares in subdued tones, their voices quickly swallowed by the oppressive quiet. It was a silence that frayed the nerves and set the mind on edge, a constant, unspoken reminder that something was deeply wrong. Inside our lodgings at 221 B. Baker Street, the quiet had amplified the restless energy of my friend Sherlock Holmes. He paced before the hearth like a caged tiger, his tall, gaunt frame casting a long, dancing shadow in the gaslight. The air was thick with the scent of strong tobacco and the low, mournful complaint of his violin, from which he would occasionally draw a sharp, discordant note that did little to soothe my own frayed nerves. As a medical man, I could almost diagnose the city's condition as a form of collective neurasthenia, a nervous exhaustion brought on by this simple yet profound disruption to its daily life. "Observe, Watson," he said suddenly, stopping his pacing to stare out the window into the gloom. "The cabbie on the corner, a man named Parker, has checked his pocket watch 3 times in as many minutes. He relies on the saint. Giles chimed to regulate his fares. Without it, he is adrift, a captain without a compass. The flower girl, little Mary, packs her basket an hour before her usual time. Her customers, she has likely concluded, are too morose to consider the purchase of a simple bloom. The entire rhythm of the street is disrupted, all for the want of a simple chime. It is a fascinating study in mass psychology. The city has lost its anchor." He turned from the window, his grey eyes glinting with an analytical light. "It reminds me of the case of the Burlstone Manor, where the cessation of a dinner gong presaged a terrible tragedy. Humans are creatures of habit, Watson. And when the machinery of their routine is broken, their minds are fertile ground for fear and suspicion." He was about to elaborate when our thoughts were shattered by a frantic, rattling knock at our front door. It was not the confident rap of a client seeking a consultation, nor the timid tap of a messenger. It was a sound of pure desperation, a frantic summons that spoke of a spirit at the end of its tether. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson showed in a young woman who looked as though she had run the whole way to our doorstep. She was tall and plainly dressed in a gown of dark grey wool, a garment chosen for its utility rather than its fashion. Her face was pale and drawn, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. But it was her eyes that captured my attention. They were a deep, intelligent blue, and though they were wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, they held a spark of fierce determination. She carried herself with a straight-backed resolve that seemed at odds with the terror that so clearly gripped her. This I knew at once was a soul in deep distress, but one not yet broken by it. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. She clutched a small, worn handbag to her chest, as if it were a shield. "My name is Eleanor Vance. Forgive my intrusion at this hour. I'm the daughter of Alistair Vance, the keeper of the St. Giles Clock Tower." "You need not explain your purpose, Miss Vance," Holmes said, his voice softening from its analytical tone to one of genuine compassion, a transformation he reserved for those he deemed truly in need. He gestured to the armchair opposite his own, the one usually occupied by clients detailing their woes. "Your father's silence is the loudest sound in London. Pray, compose yourself and tell us everything from the beginning." She sank into the chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. For a moment, she simply breathed, gathering her strength. "It began months ago," she started, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if the pattern in our Persian rug held the key to her scattered thoughts. "My father, a man who lived his life by the logic of pendulums and escapements, began to change. He was always a quiet man, a solitary man by trade, but his solitude turned dark." She described her father, Alistair Vance, as a man whose world was circumscribed by the intricate mechanics of his clock. He was a master horologist, a man who understood the delicate dance of gears and springs better than he understood the hearts of men. But this deep familiarity, she explained, had begun to curdle into a form of obsession. "He grew withdrawn, paranoid," she continued. "He spoke of the tower as if it were a living thing, a malevolent entity that whispered to him from within the machinery. He would come home to our small rooms near the tower, his hands trembling, and speak of a watcher that haunted the belfry, a shadowy figure only he could see. At first I thought it was merely the strain of his work, the long hours, the solitude. I begged him to see a doctor, but he refused. He said no physician could cure a sickness of stone and steel." She looked up, her eyes pleading for belief, for some sign that we did not think her as mad as her father. He would spend hours at his desk, not polishing gears or oiling springs, but poring over old books of local history and folklore. His journals, once filled with precise calculations and meticulous notes on the clock's performance, became filled with frantic sketches of what he saw in the shadows, of leering faces he imagined in the intricate lattice work of the belfry. "And what did he believe he was searching for?" Holmes asked, leaning forward, his own lethargy now completely vanished, replaced by the keen predatory alertness of the hunter on the scent of his quarry. "A key," she whispered, the word itself seeming to cause her pain. Not the great iron key to the tower door, of which he had a duplicate. This was another, a secret key. He called it the key to the tower's true heart. He became convinced that the watcher had stolen it from him, and that without it, the clock was in mortal danger. He said it was his sacred duty to find it, that the tower itself was demanding it of him. Her story was delivered in a low, steady voice, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the immense strain she was under. She spoke of her father's increasingly erratic behavior, his refusal to eat, his long nights spent pacing their small apartment, his habit of talking to himself in hushed, urgent tones. He had become a stranger to her, a man possessed by a delusion that was as intricate and all-consuming as the clockwork he had once mastered. He was terrified of this task, Mr. Holmes. Yet he could not abandon it, she said. It was as if the tower had laid a curse upon him. He loved that clock, you see. He had tended it for 30 years. It was his life's work, and now it was destroying him. She paused, reaching into her handbag. With trembling fingers, she retrieved a small, worn leather journal, its cover stained with oil and grime. She handled it as if it were a cursed object, a relic of the madness that had claimed her father. This was on his desk, she said. He left it open. He was fixated on this passage. He would read it aloud, over and over, until the words lost all meaning and became a kind of chant. She opened it to a marked page. There, in her father's spidery, agitated hand, a hand that had once been so steady and precise, was a cryptic rhyme, scrawled with such force that the ink had bled through the page. Where the dead sleep, the first stone was laid. By the architect's compass, a secret is made. Follow the line to the belly of the beast, to silence the heart and give it its peace. One turns the gear, one opens the vein. The last stills the voice that screams out in pain. Holmes arose from his chair and took the journal from her, his eyes gleaming with that intense, focused light that I knew so well. The languid, violin-playing esthete was gone, and in his place stood the cold, calculating logician, the supreme reasoner. He produced a large magnifying lens from his pocket and began to examine the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The paper is of common stock," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "The ink is Higgins's Eternal, a favorite among men who wish their records to last. But the handwriting, see here, Watson. The pressure is uneven. The upstrokes are firm, suggesting determination, but the downstrokes are shaky, indicative of a profound nervous agitation. And note the slight blurring on the final word. A tear, I should think. This was not written by a man in a state of calm reflection." He looked up at Miss Vance, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "When did you last see your father?" "2 nights ago," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "He came to me in a state of great excitement. He said he was close to solving the rhyme, that he finally understood what it demanded of him. He said he had to go to the tower, that he could not let the watcher win. He seemed exalted and terrified. It was the last time I saw him. And he has not been seen since?" Holmes pressed. "No, sir. I have been to the tower. The door is locked from the inside. I have called his name until I'm hoarse. There is no answer. And yesterday morning, just after the 8 o'clock chime should have sounded, the clock fell silent." Holmes stood before the fire, the journal in his hand, his mind already racing along a dozen different lines of inquiry. He was a whirlwind of focused energy, a stark contrast to the deathly stillness that had fallen over the clock tower. I watched him, and then I looked at the pale, desperate face of our client, a young woman grappling with a grief made all the more terrible by its bizarre and inexplicable nature. In that moment, as the London fog pressed against our window panes and the silence from the street seemed to seep into the very room, I felt a profound sense of dread creep into my own heart. This was no simple case of a missing man, no common tale of domestic strife or financial ruin. We had been invited into a world of madness and shadows, a world governed by cryptic rhymes and unseen watchers. I feared that before we found our way out, we too would hear the whispers from within the silent waiting tower of St. Giles. The game was afoot, as my friend would say, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a chilling premonition that the stakes of this particular game were higher and darker than any we had played before. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1 of The Case of the Clock Tower Key. If you enjoyed the mystery and want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, leave a comment, and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Your support helps keep the stories alive. See you in the next chapter.